Order, order. Thank you for joining us today for our first evidence session of the Youth Select Committee's inquiry into youth violence and social media. This session is to give us an overview of the current trends in youth violence and explore possible links to violent content on social media. Can I start by asking the panel to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your organisation, starting with Mr. Lindsay, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Ben Lindsay. I am CEO and founder of a charity called Power the Fight. We empower communities to end youth violence. And we do that in a number of ways. One, supporting young people therapeutically. So we have work in schools and we see that as a kind of an early intervention piece. We support families who have been impacted by violence. So whether that's signposting them to different services or financially supporting them. So we've given over £60,000 in the last 6 years to families who have lost young people. We also train and equip organisations that understand the issues of violence affecting young people. And finally, there's this advocacy piece where we engage with local and central government.
Hi everyone, morning. I'm Rani, Govender. I'm a policy and regulatory manager at the NSPCC. Hopefully, as young people, you'll all have heard of the NSPCC, but we are a national children's charity working to make children have safe and happy childhoods. We have 3 impact goals at the NSPCC, and one of those is about making the online world safe for every child, and that's where I focus. So my work is focused on children's safety online, and in particularly influencing legal and regulatory change to make sure that tech companies are held accountable for building safer services.
Morning everyone. My name is John Matthews. I'm the service manager for an organisation called Catch-22. Catch-22 is a national charity. We deliver a lot of different family and young people intervention services. We work with young people and families, we work in the justice sector, and we also work in employability too. The project that I work on is called the Social Switch Project, which was founded in 2019, originally funded by Google and the London Violence Reduction Unit. We were recommissioned in 2023 by the VRU solely, and our main purpose is to support the education and awareness of online harms to practitioners, trusted adults, and we've recently piloted a programme in a similar aspect, but directly for young people to raise awareness on what online harms looks like for young people too.
Thank you for your introductions. We will now begin with the session. So please could I ask Mr. Lindsay, last year the Youth Endowment Fund reported that young people's involvement in serious violence is higher than it was a decade ago, but is now falling. What is your assessment of current youth violence trends today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, the Youth Endowment Fund, you're right, they did report on how children's involvement in serious youth violence is higher than a decade ago. My history is that I've worked in this space for the best part of 20 years, and I've definitely seen that consistent rise in violence. I think the problem that we have is that we tend to focus on fatalities as opposed to the everyday violence which happens, which doesn't necessarily make the news or the media. So if you look at hospital admissions, like A&E, emergency admissions over the weekend, and when you talk to surgeons, which I have the opportunity to do, you can see that there is actually a spike in violent acts involving young people, not just in London but across the UK, but not all of that is reported and seen as evidence which then results into like a fatality. So I would definitely say that while there might be a decline in terms of what we're seeing in terms of fatalities, I think everyday violence, particularly peer-on-peer violence, is something which I'm seeing more regularly. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Govender?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk a bit from the online perspective, what we're seeing and what children are reporting. I think we're seeing increasingly that the online world is, well, we know the online world is a really important part of children's lives, and I think the things that people experience offline are often reflected in the online world as well. And often it's not about drawing a strict boundary between the two either. I think for all of us, and definitely for young people, the two intertwine and shape their lives. I think that's a really interesting trend that we're seeing in terms of youth violence. We're seeing a lot of reports about the way that social media is actually shaping this culture more, whether that's due to the pressure because you feel this is being recorded, it's being shared much more widely than maybe it would have been previously if it was just in a smaller group. So I think that's quite an interesting trend we're seeing more of, is how the online world not only reflects what people are seeing and doing offline, but is actually shaping some of those behaviours as well.
I think one thing that we're aware of is one of the current trends and themes at the moment is a rise in dis and malinformation being shared on social media, which does contribute to community violence. We saw that in the summertime with the events that happened in Southport in July, where a lot of information was spread, sometimes by online influencers who do hold a huge weight due to their popularity, their following, and some of the controversial statements that they do make. And a lot of young people do look up to some of those influencers. So that has a huge influence on steering aggression and violence towards young people towards the communities. Another thing in particular in relation to views online is misogyny. We're seeing a huge rise of misogyny and violence against women and girls, and different views perpetuated towards how women should be perceived within society as well. That's one of the huge concerns we have too.
Sienna, I believe you had a question?
Yeah, you talked about how the trends of like everyday violence is increasing, and like misogyny and misinformation. Why do you think that is?
Possibly talking about how what might drive people to write about such things on social media.
So from our research, a lot of the influencers that do put out a lot of controversial views have openly declared that they are monetising those views, and they make an income from their viewership that they get from people that tune into their profiles on social media. So we know that does play a huge part in it. Glamorisation as well plays a huge part in it too. We've got a lot of influencers in particular that like to show off their cars, how much money they've got, their lifestyle, or the women that they may have in their life, or men in particular. It can be sort of indifferent. I think that plays a huge part in that too. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any comments on what might drive serious youth violence among the youth, and also who is most likely to be affected by it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a very complex question to answer, because there are multiple things which we could say drives youth violence. I think we've got to look at poverty being one issue. When we look at the areas which have been impacted by violence affecting young people, it tends to be some of the poorer areas in the country. But there's also other things which we often don't want to talk about because it's hard to put a face to some of these things. So when we talk about austerity and we talk about how the youth sector, organisations, has been kind of absolutely ripped apart in terms of funding, we have to look at over the last 10 to 15 years, when we look at actually there is no youth centres around. There is the youth workers. I was a learning mentor back in 2003. There was lots of learning mentors. Now that is not something which is as apparent. I think we've got to look at also the fact that when we look at neurodiversity in young people and that not being diagnosed, and how different people respond to different situations. Young people's emotional health, well-being, mental health is something which, particularly after COVID, we're seeing in our organisation is becoming a lot more apparent. I think if we look at school exclusions, and there's research which tells you that actually when you have a young person excluded from school, and if they end up in a pupil referral unit, there is a high chance that they could end up in criminality as well. There's a lot of kind of systems and institutions which also need to be talked about. And then also just the lack of employment opportunities for young people is something where if you combine that with poverty and then maybe poor mental health, adverse childhood experiences, all these words which you would have heard of, But I think it's actually quite interesting when that's maybe from an adult's perspective. But when you actually look at what young people are saying, and it's interesting that you talk about the Youth Endowment Fund and what they've come out with, young people would say, like, gang membership, drug use, drug habits, loss of control, alcohol use, and social media comes up in that. It's quite interesting. I think it's a combination of all these things, and I think it's important to have a young person's perspective when we're looking at some of these trends and causes.
Yeah, and I think, just building on both of those points, when we're looking at the research, I think there's two things to bring out. One is that a lot of research has shown that in terms of the impact and who's being exposed to violent content online, that children now see that as an unavoidable part of being on social media, which I think is a really poor indictment of how these services are protecting children. And it's seen as young as primary school ages, children are starting to see this content, and then it becomes seen as a normal part of their online lives. Research has also, though, shown as well that particularly for maybe disadvantaged children, they are more likely to be exposed to this content or more likely to see it as well. But I think just going back to the normalisation point in talking about what's driving this and why it's occurring, I think it's really important to think about the impact of seeing this as just a part of everyday life and the impact that has on children's mental health and well-being, but also maybe their behaviours as well. I think we know, for example, that children don't report often when they see violent and other types of harmful content online. And I think this idea that this is just an accepted part of online life is something that's and therefore part of our everyday wider lives is a really concerning trend as well.
I just want to ask on one of your points, Ben, that you mentioned neurodiversity, and I know 1 in 3 young people go through the criminal justice system with an undiagnosed neurodiverse condition, so maybe could you expand on how that correlates to youth violence?
Yeah, I suppose in the experience of the work we do at Power to Fight, if we just take the school setting, for example, our experience, it tends to be when ADHD or autism is not diagnosed, there tends to be a correlation between what some people would deem as bad behaviour, and therefore what we can also know and tell is that some bad behaviour can then lead to consequences and dissensions and then maybe exclusions. So you have to take a step right back and say, actually, maybe this stuff isn't actually bad behaviour. There is actually a neurodiverse condition which needs to be assessed, and therefore I can definitely see that some of the young people that we have worked with who have ended up in the criminal justice system did not get a diagnosis earlier on, and if had they done that, I think a lot more support would have been able to have been given. So that's probably one of those examples. But then also I've seen it with the police as well, that because a young person may have ADHD, how they then respond in those situations where there's panic and fear. And I think we have to talk about fear. I think there's a lot of misconception that every young person who has a knife is in a gang or, are out for criminality. And most of the young people that we have worked with would say it's out of fear. I am scared from going from my house to school, and I would rather take my chance for protection than anything else. And that may seem weird for most of us in this room, but that is what we're talking about. It is a lot of fear and anxiety. And sometimes when I talk to adults about this, I say, have we never done anything silly when we are fearful or we're scared? And everybody says yes, and I said, well, here we go. So I think the neurodiversity thing is the fact that it's not easy to get assessments. If you go private, that's £2,000 to get an ADHD assessment. And then we know the NHS waiting list for that type of assessment is long. So there's a period of time where there's a lot of young people who could be falling through the system simply because they're not being assessed and being given the right support.
I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to move to the next question. Macy?
So that's my question. I'm going to take it over to you, Miss Govender, first, if that's okay. You mentioned a bit about it in the previous question, but I'd love to hear a bit more in depth about what you have to say. How do you feel that young people experience content that depicts serious violence online, such as knife crime?
Does it impact them?
How it impacts you?
Yeah, I think
how they experience it. Like how different ways in how they are exposed to that online?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we look at the research, there is, I think violent content, when we're saying it's normalised, it's because it does pop up in so many different ways. And sometimes that might be because it's news and information, but sometimes it's because it's local recordings of videos of things that are happening. Children do talk about the impact of games that they're playing and the kind of embedded nature of violence in a lot of those as well. And then we also, whether it might be like in the local context, or we know that these sensationalist types of content do get picked up on social media, and algorithms play a significant role in then recommending those. And children do report that it feels, once you've started to click on something because maybe you didn't realise what it was, or maybe it grabs your interest, and then after that you continue to get fed those types of content. That's something that we hear from children about all sorts of harmful content, and includes violent material as well. I think that's where it comes back to a feeling of not being empowered to make the choices about what you want to see and do on social media. And so it can be quite easy to feel that you're just trapped and this is what it's feeding you. And so one other example of a functionality on social media which seems to cause a risk to children is private and anonymous accounts, which are essentially dedicated to sharing violent material. That's another form of harm we see. I think it's interesting, a lot of these social media services would say they're set up to mainly to connect people with their friends and families. Maybe people can run their own businesses and influence. But actually what we're seeing is these types of accounts which are just dedicated to sharing harmful and dangerous material. That might be accounts, that might be in private messaging as well, and in group chats and so on. So I think if we look across the design of social media, at every point we can see different types of risk in different ways that children might encounter violent content.
If I could just jump in, because I think that is a really, really good point. I think there's another side, which is about how accessible and the speed of social media. So yes, there are dedicated accounts, and we can talk about social media companies allowing certain accounts to have the freedom to have that content. But there's something about also real-time situations and real-time violence, which becomes accessible to everyone and all young people. So I'll give you a quick example. A few years ago, a young person we worked with lost their life to knife crime. And at the time, I was leading a camp in Norwich, but this happened in London. There was 8,000 young people in Norwich, 1,000 of them were from London, but when this person lost their life, it was caught on Snapchat. And then what then happened was that everyone in London, or everyone in Norwich from London, saw all this stuff on Snapchat. So the speed of what was going on went 200 miles, and then we had a safeguarding issue in Norwich. So it isn't just about the content, it's also, we are now seeing real-time people losing their lives, trying to, people who were trying to save lives. All that content is coming out because of the speed of access. So it is about the content, but it's also what we are now being able to access in a way we weren't 20 years ago.
Thank you. Just before I bring it over to you, Mr. Matthews, I just wanted to ask a question to anyone who would like to answer about algorithms and what your assessment is and how algorithms can influence how young people are exposed to social media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think algorithms, recommender systems, they are now like the integral way that most social media sites function. Certainly in your kind of like the main place you would usually use an app is being driven in many cases by an algorithm. And I think this comes back to violent content, the misogynistic content we were talking about before, is that they feed off content which is getting that higher engagement. It's all about the business model. They want those views, they want people to stay engaged, and sharing more alarming material is one way of doing that. And people might watch it in disgust or being, confused or upset by it, but that's not what the algorithm thinks about. They just think that people are looking at it for longer, and that leads them to then sharing more of it. It's something when we look at particularly like dangerous misogynistic content as well, something we particularly see for young boys as platforms. They collect the information so that they know potentially that it is a young boy using their service, and then once they might have engaged with one or two of these videos, it becomes really, really difficult to break out of that. I know some services offer a feature where you can sort of refresh your algorithm, but participation work we've done with children suggests that they just don't think those systems are effective enough at the minute. It feels once you get into the cycle, it's really difficult to remove yourself from them. And so I think it's absolutely something that needs to be looked at in the design of services.
Yeah. We know that social media algorithms are individual as well, so that each platform has their own algorithm type, and we know that these algorithms are designed to keep young people engaged in those platforms. That's what they're designed for, and often what young people don't quite understand is how an algorithm actually works. It is down to the recency of that post, it is the interactivity from other people, how viral it's got, how many followers the poster has, how you interact with that post in particular, whether you view it for just a couple of seconds, whether you go onto the comments to see what other people are saying, if you like or share, or even if someone shares it with you and then you see that is how algorithms work. It does, like Ben said, it does spread a lot more vastly and quicker across social media platforms, and that is just a bit of a concern for us, that young people maybe are not quite sure how those algorithms work and how to understand how to get the best of their algorithms. You can beat an algorithm. If you think positively, you'll have more positive thought processes that come into your mind, and it's the same thing that applies to social media platforms. If you look for specific content type, you will continue to see that. Some of our young people that we've engaged with, there was one in particular that we engaged with earlier on this year, said that she often chooses to sit in her bedroom, doom scrolling, watching violent content, while her family members sit downstairs interacting with each other and having, and spending quality time with one another. And that is often where young people get caught up in those echo chambers, where they are finding it really difficult to detach from those algorithms and their devices. And just another thing I wanted to mention as well is the relation to cyber trauma. Often when young people have experienced trauma at some point in their lives, they tend to seek trauma-related incidences because it poses as a comfort blanket to those young people. So if they have experienced something previously, or it could be related to a social media incident, they will continue to want to see that type of content, which then poses more risks to that young person's well-being.
Thank you. Just briefly before we pass on to the next question, I wanted to ask a question to you, Mr. Lindsay, and the rest of the panel after. On the Youth Endowment Fund website, they mentioned how, to do with algorithms, how only 6% of the young people who came across violent content did so intentionally, and 50% cited seeing it via someone else's profile or feed. How do you think that, and what is your opinion on how algorithms and unsolicited and unwanted violent content on young people's social media and online could be combated, or what do you think that we could do?
Yeah, again, it's a really big question, and it's an important one. I mean, I think there's probably two main ways I would look at this. One, there does need to be a lot more regulation with social media companies on how the content is getting into the hands of young people. And I think it's a great point about the algorithms. Like, there are ways that I'm sure you can beat it, but it's really tricky. There's times when I've seen it with my own children. They are watching a YouTube video about football, and then the next thing what comes up is something which has got nothing to do with FIFA or anything like that. So it's kind of like, it is odd how that works. So I think first of all, there has to be social media companies need to be held to account that this is the impact, and so that's important. I think then the second thing is, and something which we also do at Power to Fight, there's this education piece for parent and carers as well. Because a lot of the parent and carers that we engage with have no idea about how to use even mobile phones at some points, but then the understanding of whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, this is like a foreign language, and therefore there's something about how we educate parents and carers and schools as well. I work in lots of schools, and even the mobile phone policies vary from school to school. Some schools are like, oh, you can have them in your pocket. Other schools, it's completely locked away until home time. So it doesn't feel like there's a consistent message for young people, and it doesn't feel like there's a consistent message for parents and carers as well. So in a nutshell, I think there's an education piece for all of us, but particularly parents and carers. And I think there needs to be more pressure on social media to actually social media companies to understand their responsibility for the content which is coming out.
Thank you. Would any the other panel members like to speak on that?
I was
point?
just going to echo what Ben said. I completely agree with what he was saying there. In particular with education, we definitely need to be upskilling parents, practitioners, young people a lot more on how to navigate through those. I think platforms do need to take a little bit more accountability in their reporting mechanisms. A lot of the young people we engage with say that when they do report harmful content or videos that are violent, that their posts are kept up, and the reporting that they get back is that this doesn't breach our guidelines, which is a concern for us. Another key thing as well for us is something that I personally believe in is personal accountability too. I think since before the pandemic, social media did sort of blast, but when we've come into the pandemic, social media sort of grew exponentially, and everyone's interactivity with platforms was just supercharged. And I think what is important that we try and think about our personal boundaries and having a healthy balance with our devices. We don't always need to go on devices all the time. I think the statistic that we worked out is around an average young person spends near enough 6 hours and 22 minutes online each day, which is a staggering amount of time. Now that is just on an average basis. So creating those healthy boundaries can support young people in navigating through that as well.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. We are going through our time, so if I could ask the witnesses to be a little bit more concise so we can get as much information as possible. I will hand over to Monia.
Thank you. How far would you believe that online exposure to violent behaviour can lead to incidents of real-life violence? And could we start with Mr. Lindsay, please?
Definitely, I've seen in the past 10 years, whether that has been very geographically specific, particularly with maybe particular music videos and films and content which has come out, and that's something which I have seen where different people from different areas will make that type of content, and that can result in violence. I think it's probably shifted a little bit now where, as we've spoken about, there's just so much content out there that it's very hard to kind of maneuver away from it as a young person. But I do think there is a link. I do think when you see this type of content, there is more fear and anxiety which comes up with young people. We've just heard that if the average young person is spending 6 hours a day and this content is readily available and you're doom scrolling, it's massive. So I do think there's a massive link. I think fear, anxiety, trauma, impacts on your mental health is something which is a clear link from the work that we've done.
Anything else to add? No?
I just echo everything that Ben said. I think, like I referenced earlier, with the misinformation that was spread on social media in July this year, I think that easily translates to sort of taking young people into vulnerable positions where they believe information that is malinformation, which can then result in community violence as well. It's very easy for people to have freedom of speech and just say whatever they want on social media, and it be believed by young people.
Thank you. Beth?
You did briefly touch on this, so apologies, but do you believe that there is a role that parents should play in the protection of young people, and what would that be, to what extent?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think at the NSPCC, one thing that we always try and keep the emphasis on is that tech services ultimately have to take the accountability here. They are designing these platforms in a way which is just fundamentally unsafe at the minute, and there has to be a change in that design choice. I think it's really, these are huge organisations with the resource and the expertise to make a real difference, and they should take that responsibility. But absolutely, we think parents can really play a role in supporting children. We know a lot of parents want to. It's worrying when they hear about all this sort of material that's online. I think it's really important that you're building I suppose having open conversations about what you're seeing and doing online. I think it can be really easy to think that that's just, I'm not on Snapchat, I don't get it, and so use that to put a bit of a wedge between you. Actually taking those opportunities to understand how the online world works, what it is that you're seeing, who you're connecting with, what do you like doing online, but then also what are some of those challenges as well. I think that can help, or we know that really does help with children feeling that then when things go wrong or they see something that upsets them or isn't right, that's also something they can go and speak to their parent about.
I think it's also, we have to acknowledge, and I speak as a parent, there is huge pressure on parents and carers when you are getting bombarded by your children. I want a mobile phone, I want this, and so it's very tricky to know where to draw the line. And so I think there's something about how we help parents and carers to deal with that very real pressure from young people and their peers. And I think, I could go on more, but I think that is something which we need to help and support parents. And just the other thing that I'll quickly say, I think we also need to look at poverty again, because for some parents and carers, this is not a priority. And therefore, how we again help other parents and carers in different socio-economic situations to appreciate that this is also really has a serious impact. It's something which is going to require a lot of nuance, and something I would say around cultural awareness and sensitivity of different cultures.
Okay, if anybody doesn't have anything else to add, I will hand over to Manel for question 5.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by starting with Mr. Lindsay, but then opening to everyone. What is your current assessment of the UK government's online safety strategy?
I think, if I'm honest, I always feel that we can go further. I'm sure there's a lot of goodwill and ideas which come through some of the online strategy, but I think we can go further. And I feel, it's been mentioned, until there's proper accountability from the social media companies that the content which is on their platforms has a real life impact on millions of children and adults as well, we are just going to go around in circles. So my short answer to that is that it's not good enough. We can go further, and we should go further, because this has a real life impact on communities. And if we're talking about trying to create more peaceful communities, and we really do care about the emotional well-being of young people, we have to go to the very top and put more pressure on the social media companies to act in this very serious space where young people are losing their lives over this stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. So I think the passage of the Online Safety Act last year was a really important milestone in terms of expanding protections for children online and making sure tech companies are assessing the risks of their service and putting the right safety solutions in place. I think what we see that's the starting point, but now we need to go much further, we need to go quicker, and we need to be ambitious with it. So our assessment of Ofcom's work so far to implement the regulation is that it's been a good start. We've got the foundations in place, but again, I think there's much more we need to do. And if I just highlight maybe a couple of areas where I think we need to be looking at going much further. One of them is about enforcing minimum age limits on platforms and then making sure children are having age-appropriate experiences. I think we all know at the minute that a lot of platforms say they're for 13 plus, but actually that's just a tick box and it's not enforced. I think it's really powerful, and I think it was Ofcom's research that they did on violent content, that most children had seen violent content on social media in primary school. Now, primary school age children shouldn't technically be able to make these accounts, but social media platforms haven't got those right protections in place. And we've not seen enough change yet on how is minimum age limits going to be enforced properly, so that children aren't being exposed too young. And then when children are on those platforms, how are we giving them the right user empowerment tools, but also the right protections to make sure that they're having appropriate experiences and gaining that independence as they grow older? one other thing that we'd like to see be a much greater focus of the work that the government are doing and the Ofcom are doing, again, they've made a start, but we think there's further to go, is actually how are children and young people's voices being a part of this decision-making, informing plans. One example I always go back to, and it links to violent content actually, is when we're looking at the risks of grooming, we think adults shouldn't be able to connect with children online. Children should only be connecting with people they know, people in their schools and their communities. And I'm certainly not saying that isn't true, but actually when we look at some of the violent content, a lot of it is very local in nature. It's sharing local street fights, violence that takes place in schools, and it's all people that are connected within a community seeing it. That doesn't mean we don't need the other protections, but it means we need something that's different for children. But actually it's only through working with children that we can understand what are those different nuances of how you're experiencing the online world, what changes depending on the harm type, and we can develop those solutions that really target it. There has been some work to engage with children and young people in developing these, but we want to see the formal mechanisms in place to make sure that that's a routine part of policy making.
Yeah, we welcome the Online Safety Act. We think it's a really good piece of legislation. I think one concern that we have is that social media has been around for nearly 3 decades, and we've got regulation in place at this point. Is it going to be able to sort of live up to 30 years of existence of social media platforms? I'm suppose that's something we'll just kind of have to see as it rolls out. I think that we want to focus on in particular is around the platform's transparency with how they're going to better protect and safeguard young people, and also how they're going to audit and enforce any sort of breaches of their guidelines and adaptation with the Online Safety Act. We want to see how they're going to make that a lot more clear. We've seen what the reporting mechanisms look like on some of the platforms, but we're not 100% confident that they're followed through. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out over the next few years.
Thank you.
Just briefly, do you believe that the Online Safety Act can effectively protect young people from exposure to such content?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I do. I think John's right that we've not had regulation on services for far too long, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible, and I think we need to be ambitious and believe in the power that this change can bring. Built into the Act is the safety duties for children, which mean that platforms need to protect them from exposure to harmful content, and violent content is listed in the Online Safety Act as a type of that content. So I think it does have the power. I think we can do much more with algorithms, with how content moderation works, with the efficacy of reporting systems, content warnings. I think there's so many options available that a combination of those with the proper resource implemented effectively can make a huge difference to the experience of children have online. And actually we're starting to see the move already with the Act having come in. You might have seen some tech platforms have announced they're having teen accounts which have extra protections now and so on. So I think that's already an indication that they've seen the Online Safety Act and the regulation is coming and that they need to start making these changes. There's always going to be more we can do, and we should be ambitious, but we also shouldn't lose hope that we can make a difference here, because I think we can.
What has crossed our mind is that young people are really intelligent. They know social media a lot better than probably we do in some of the work that we deliver, and I think young people can find the loopholes and the gaps that they can sort of, and I can see you guys nodding here, so I'm glad that you agree with me, is that you can probably find ways of going about some of the potential barriers that may be put in the way when it comes to the Online Safety Act. So how much of a barrier is the Act going to be in place of protecting young people from being exposed to these things?
Yeah, I think it definitely can make a difference and keep young people safe. I just feel that it has to somehow be able to evolve and adapt quickly, because the speed of what we are dealing with, I mean, we've not even really spoken about the impact of AI and some of the things we're talking about with the deep fake stuff. Like, this stuff is moving at like a rapid speed. So I do think it can keep young people safe, but I just think there needs to be a slightly different approach with any type of kind of legislation or policy, where, particularly when we're talking about social media, there has to be this evolution, and it can't just be a static document.
Thank you. And I will move on to our question with Zafira.
Thank you. This question is to Mr. Matthews first. From your research and work with young people, what do you think? What do young people think? What changes are needed to improve their experience on social media? So we've seen recently Australia has introduced a social media ban for under 16s. And from your experience, do you think that UK should adopt a similar approach?
I think young people are indifferent from the conversations we've had, that they do support a ban, but they are the people that have been exposed to violent content, and some other young people don't agree with that. We want to find the balance as an organisation that is more bespoke and personalised to an individual. We really encourage transparent and open conversations at home. We want to encourage young people to have positive trust and relationships with the adults that they live with, so that they can confide in them if they are exposed to violence, so that they can be supported and guided through those means. We think education could be improved, and getting young people to understand through education how they can better be supported and be aware of what some of those concerns are on social media. I know in the Youth Endowment Fund study, they've mentioned that a lot of young people support the phone ban at the moment, which is absolutely fine. I think we definitely need to listen to what Youth Voice has got to say. That's really important for us. I think I think that's it from me for now.
Thank you. You mentioned about education too. So do you have any suggestions on what type of education this will be? What kind of media literacy and how that will be implemented? Would it be within schools?
So the project that we deliver, we obviously train practitioners, trusted adults, and we've piloted a programme for young people within schools. We've engaged with one mainstream school in London, and we've also engaged with a couple of different pupil referral units within London as well. One thing that we've found in particular is that young people who attend pupil referral units often have different views to young people who attend mainstream schools, and they have been more exposed to online violence. So we've had some really healthy conversations with those, and how we develop a curriculum to support young people who are more at risk of seeing online harmful content. I think having a package similar to what we do at Social Switch, and I'm not trying to do a plug here, but having a package in schools is really important, whether that's a part of PHSE, whether it's a commissioned service that comes in and delivers intervention work with young people, or whether it's some form of training for young people to make them aware of what online harmful content looks like, how they can identify peer-on-peer abuse and exposure to online harms, and how they can report and emotionally regulate themselves when it comes to understanding how online violence impacts their mental well-being.
Yes, can I come in? Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit again about the issue of bans and children's views. So at the NSPCC, we have a group called the Voice of Online Youth, and that's a group of about 14 young people from across the UK. They came to our office the other week to meet with the Secretary of State for DSIT, so Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and this topic of bans came up. And to share their perspectives, they said there are just far too many risks online, and they want the government to take those seriously, but they don't want the benefits that they experience to be forgotten either. I think they spoke very powerfully about the communities they can form, the connections, how they learn about the wider world, and just a real fear that that's going to be lost if we just go with something as blanket as a ban. We need to make sure those protections are right, that there's age-appropriate experiences, but they're worried about that. They also said that realistically, how is this going to be enforced? In reality, does it not just mean that children will find, as we were saying, other ways to go online, but actually the protections won't be in place, and they might be more fearful of speaking up about it because they feel they shouldn't have been there in the first place. I think from the work we've done at NSPCC, working more generally with children and what protections they do think would make a difference, I think there's a real balance between what more can tech companies can be doing, but how can they be more empowered as well to make decisions online. So they want tech companies to have, well, I won't repeat it, all the things we were talking about today, but also for them to have more choice over what they're seeing, more controls, that better education so they can make those decisions about what they're seeing and doing online. And those two kind of elements coming together could really help have more positive experiences.
Personally, I'm not in favour of a ban because I don't think in the history of anything, when you ban things for young people, it doesn't necessarily stop young people from engaging with those. That's just the nature of adolescence. When you're an adolescent, and when sometimes you're an adult, immediate gratification is one of the things that you want, and you take more risks anyway as an adolescent. So I'm not convinced that a ban works. I think what would be better is that there is a lot more support to walk young people through and navigate and help them navigate social media. I think that piece of education is much more important and probably has a longer term benefit as young people grow into adults, to walk through them with issues as opposed to just saying a blanket ban. I think it's important to also say, violence is never the cause, it's the consequence of something else. So we've got to go behind the headlines. So when we're talking about education, while I agree that online safety is an important piece, we've got to go before that. So we've got to look at things like violence against women and girls. We've got to look at like contextual safeguarding. It isn't just about safety in the home, it's what is going on in geography and the journey between school and home. We've got to look at, are organisations such as schools or institutions culturally aware and sensitive and understand the needs of young people and specific communities as well? Because how a family from one community might engage with online harm will be very different to another family depending on the culture, but we have to get into the nuance of some of these things. So yeah, that would be just like some of my comments on that question.
Thank you. I will pass over to Manel to speak about the support available for young people.
Oh yeah. So I just wanted to ask, I guess this is quite an open question, so to anyone really. Do you feel as though there's a difference in the quality or the level of support available for those who encounter youth violence online versus offline? I know it's quite long.
Yeah. Okay. I think support. I think that's a really good question in terms of what level of support there is for young people being impacted by violence. I think that's just the baseline question, and I don't think there's as much support as we would like. And I think there's levels to this. Is it the young people who we think could be impacted by violence? Is it the young people in communities who have experienced violence? Is it the young people who have maybe been either survivors of or victims or perpetrators? And we know that there's a fine line between all of those things. I think it's hard. I think I don't think there is much support out there. Again, this isn't a plug, but I know that as like Power to Fight, we go into schools and we talk about all these types of issues which impact young people. But we're in schools specifically in South East London. I know Catch 22 are in different environments. There's lots of organisations doing amazing work, but it's not enough. And often there are waiting lists for young people to get that level of support, whether it's post a violent situation or even if we're talking about emotional well-being. So I don't think there's enough support. I think it could be better, whether that's offline or online. But I'm also hopeful as well, because I think the fact that we're even having these conversations, and I do know some of the great work of the organisations across the UK are doing, I'm hopeful that more support will come. But we need, as from a charity perspective, we need more support, more funding, more resources.
Any of you two, or if not, that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you. I will hand over to Sophie if you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned earlier. If we could start with Mr. Lindsay, again, if either of you two would like to join in. What can be done to take the pressure off parents, both those who are trying to keep their children protected from harmful content online, or those whose socio-economic situations make that more difficult to do so?
Yeah, I think we've got to, first of all, try and empower teachers and schools as well, and give them the tools to also be able to teach students and parents and carers. If we look at the school system, that most young people in there 8 hours of the day, and that's where they're getting a lot of their ideas, whether it's in a teaching context or from their peers. So it makes sense for me that that's one of the places, and I know there are some schools which will do a lot of seminars and presentations, but the reality is that when we're talking about different socio-economic situations for families, that is not always an easy place. If you're working 2 or 3 jobs, probably the last thing you're going to want to do is then do a seminar at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the evening. So we've got to be able to adapt and work out ways where families who are more or less in a better socio-economic position have different ways that they can access real important information about online safety. But it is difficult, and I think it is a tricky space.
Yeah, I think another element I'd add, and I've already mentioned it already, but taking that pressure off parents and children is about these tech companies being safer by design. So that's not having reactive measures. I mean, yes, we need to be able to report, parental controls need to be there, but if the onus is all on these follow-up support mechanisms, that's a lot of responsibility on families to take, and the support needs to be there, but we need to look at how we're preventing these harms in the first place. I thought one thing I found really interesting when I was doing a bit of reading for coming to this is looked at different reports that look at exposure to violent content on social media, and one content found that TikTok and X were the worst, one found that it was Snap, Instagram and WhatsApp. One found that YouTube was particularly poor, and I know through calls to Childline that Reddit is one that comes up a lot. I don't think any of those studies are wrong. I think it's just a reminder that this is a problem across social media platforms, and it's really challenging for parents to know where to look and where to target, because there is no one way that if you weren't on that platform or if you just did this at the minute, there's no ideal solution. That's why it does need to come back to the tech services and that real focus on safety by design being embedded into the into the platform to begin with, so that everyone can feel more empowered when they're using them, and that's children and parents as well.
And Sienna, I believe you had a question?
Yeah, we talked a bit about the algorithm a lot today, and of like social media and how it targets young people in a way, but we also touched a bit about misogyny, and how much do you think harmful misogynistic content targeted towards young people can increase the violence against women and girls?
I think it makes a massive difference. I think it does actually have an impact on how particularly boys see girls, and I think it's something which we've definitely seen in a school's work, where specific influencers, the content that they have put out on social media platforms then plays out in the interactions with girls. So I think it's the gender-based violence conversation, which often can come from watching some of these influencers, is something we really do need to take seriously. And I've definitely seen an increase. I mean, I think I would argue that the way boys have been encouraged to engage with young girls and girls is something which isn't a new thing. I mean, I think if we look around us, the way the world is and the way the media looks at, they tend to put boys on a level which is just not right and not fair. But I think what we're seeing with social media is that people with massive platforms and big voices are now seeping into our living rooms, and it's coming out in different ways. I mean, it's not even just so much the platforms which you've mentioned. Some of this stuff can even come out when you're just playing video games and computer games, that just some nuanced bits and pieces where you're like, that actually is quite a sexist approach to how we're even playing a game. I mean, if I think of something like Fortnite and just looking at how women or girls and women are depicted in that, I'm blown away. And that isn't Snapchat, that isn't TikTok, that is a PlayStation 5 game, you know. So it's something we just need to be aware of. It's all around us.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think we can definitely say this is having an impact on how children think about themselves, about their peers. I'll just reference again a couple of contacts to Childline on this issue. One of them that has really stuck with me was a girl calling and saying that everyone, I think it was Andrew Tate, everyone in her class had been watching Andrew Tate, and we're now starting to like kind of share similar message. And she said, how is this going to impact my future if this is like the vision our generation has as girls and women? And then a different kind of example is where I think we've kind of seen those attitudes then feed more into behaviours as well, is the creation, as we mentioned before, of AI and the creation of deepfake imagery, and that being used in a sexual harassment sense to bully people. And we've seen that is particularly gendered in nature and impacting girls as well. So I think we are seeing these real consequences already of the impacts that it's having, certainly.
I think one of the other concerns is the emergence of women who also display misogynistic views and sort of share their thoughts on how women are sort of inferior in society in comparison to men. Just to read a quote, the world would crumble without men, but the world would function fine without women, is a quote from a female online influencer. Having those types of negative female influencers on platforms kind of backs up the men that say those things as well, so it kind of makes it feel like women agree with men as well, so young boys should treat women that way. That then leads into tech facilitated abuse. We've got some online male influencers again, and Rani's just sort of referenced one there who has openly talked about tracking of women. People are now using Ring doorbells, AirTags and different sort of technological devices to be able to track and monitor where women are and where other people are within society, which is a really scary thing for us. And my last point that I'm going to mention here is we've now got young people wanting to become influencers. I think the statistic is around 75% of young people aspire to be an influencer in the future. We've got one example to give around a young male who does Vox Pop style YouTube vlogs, where he goes to Stratford shopping centre and talks to guys about about women and slut shaming young females by referring to them as something called a sket. It's not really a word I'm too familiar with, but that is a piece of a new word that is kind of emerging amongst the younger generation. So having those kinds of young people trying to aspire to be like that on social media is only going to influence other young people to want to participate in that kind of behaviour, and that comes with views, again, monetisation and glamorisation too.
Very, very briefly, if you guys were able to give one piece of advice to the government currently about what they could do to tackle this issue, or something that they should take on board in one sentence, what would that be and why?
You have to make sure that young people are at the heart of these decisions and these new pieces of legislation and bits that are going to be contributed to how we navigate through social media moving forward. It's really important.
I would say that one, because that's brilliant. And then one more would be, how are we looking at emerging technology and making sure that our policy and regulation keeps up with the pace of change? We have an AI bill coming. How is child protection going to be at the heart of that, and making sure that we don't, in a sense, repeat some of the mistakes we've made with social media?
I think I would say that the social media companies need to be reminded of their social responsibility to the communities, and that has to be a top priority and enforced by the government. And we need to then, if that doesn't happen, we have to start thinking about not very, very serious fines for those social media organisations when they don't take the CSR seriously.
That concludes our session. Thank you for joining us. If you do have any more information you would like to submit to our inquiry, please do feel free. There's information on how to do that on the UK Parliament website. But yeah, thank you for joining us. Order, order.